Welcome to Tarot with Bonnie and Peter, where we take the mystery out of the tarot and help you bring this ancient practice into everyday life. In this podcast, we'll talk about life, tarot, and everything in between. So grab your tarot deck, get comfortable, and start your journey to tarot with Bonnie and Peter. Hi, everyone. I'm Peter, and welcome to Tarot with Bonnie and Peter. Today, we are thrilled to have Liz Worth with us. Liz Worth has been using the tarot for almost 20 years, has been working full-time as what she calls a card slinger since 2015, working with thousands of clients over that time. She's taught tarot to hundreds of people as a guest speaker at conferences throughout North America, including the massive Reader Studio in New York City, Northwest Tarot Symposium in Portland, Oregon, and the Allura Tarot and Divination Festival just down the road from Bonnie and I in beautiful Allura, Ontario. I'll do a plug for Allura if you've never visited and you're in that area. It's such a beautiful spot. Liz is the author of 2 books on tarot, Going Beyond the Little White Book, A Contemporary Guide to Tarot, and The Power of Tarot, which have sold over 2,000 copies. I'd actually hold up my copy of The Power of Tarot, but it is such a good book. I'm positive that I lent it to a fellow practitioner who probably kept it and hasn't given it back. Liz is also a novelist and poet, her most recent publication being Inside Every Dream, A Raging Sea. She has an active and prolific student base. Over 300 students have passed through her tarot programs, myself included, in courses that include topics such as tarot foundations, tarot gateways. She does tarot business coaching, and as well as her most recent course that she started in February called Tarot for Magic, Spellcraft, and the Strange. The last thing I'm going to mention, though, just like a past guest of ours, Nancy Antonucci, and myself, she's a huge fan of the 80s and 80s music in particular. If that's you, you can actually catch some of the back episodes of her Forever 80s podcast. With all of that knowledge, all of that know-how and experience, we get to chat with Liz right here today on A Tarot with Bonnie and Peter. So Liz, welcome to our space.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks, Bonnie. It's great to be here.
We're so excited to have you here.
Really
and you are such a wealth of knowledge as well. We were chatting a little bit before we started recording, and I told you how much I love being on your website and just wanting to learn more from you. So we always like to ask our guests sort of, how did you get into tarot? Like, what inspired you? Did it find you? Do you want to tell us a little bit about your your history with this magnificent tool, I guess we can call it?
Yeah. I had a couple of different beginnings with tarot. So I had what I call, my accidental or false start with tarot, in that I was always really drawn to the esoteric and the occult and mythology when I was a kid. And I think a lot of children are, because we're so imaginative when we're kids, and these things really do activate your imagination. And my mom was really into readings, and she would have psychics come to the house and read at parties, and she would record those sessions and then let me listen to them later. And so she really was quite open about those types of practices, and it left the impression on me that these things were just normal, that they were part of everyday life. And I didn't have friends who had necessarily similar experiences in terms of what their parents were exposing them to or what they were allowing them to engage with. And so I grew up with this appreciation for the occult and for practices like divination because of that. And when I was in middle school, and I was around 13, I spent a summer learning how to read playing cards because my mom had bought me a book in the impulse aisle at the checkout counter at the grocery store about fortune telling. And there was a little chapter in there about how to read playing cards. And I spent my summer off school when I was 13 practicing from that chapter. And that was my first introduction to card reading. a few years later, when I was around 16, I bought my first tarot deck, but I didn't really know a lot about tarot. This was in the mid 90s when you went to the bookstore and you wanted to learn about tarot or witchcraft. There was usually a fairly small section called the New Age section. And at the time, Wicca
like one
was
shelf.
Yeah,
one shelf. Yeah.
At the very back of the bookstore,
yes.
usually. Yeah.
It's a little shelf. There'd be a few tarot decks on there, and Wicca was very popular. And so if you want to learn about witchcraft, then that was usually what you had on hand there. Those were your options. And a lot of books on Wicca at the time would connect tarot as a practice to witchcraft. And they would say, if you want to be a witch, then these are all the things you need to do. And you need to learn how to read cards. Someone out there probably knows where that idea originally came from. I'm not sure. I don't know that I subscribe to this idea now that that witchcraft and divination necessarily have to go hand in hand, or that tarot has some kind of association with witchcraft. But I was always under this impression that these two go together, and I was interested in these things again because you tend to gravitate towards those practices in your teens, and so I was starting to expose myself to tarot that way, but I didn't have a great entry point into it because the references that I had available to me at the time, pre-internet, and also as a teenager with not a lot of cash resources, I couldn't really get a good handle on what tarot was because I lacked a lot of context for it. And so I got a deck. I expected that I would be able to somehow read these cards instantly. Another common mistake that we make. I would, try to read them, wasn't satisfied with how it was going, put them aside. And I didn't come back to tarot until I was in my mid-20s. But I was always still interested in these things. I think I felt a little bit discouraged and didn't quite have the patience or the knowledge to understand really how to engage with tarot properly. But when I was in my mid-20s, I had published my first book, and I was having a whole spiritual and emotional crisis after publishing this book for a variety of reasons. And I was sort of trying to figure out what to do next with my life. And I went to see an astrologer who I was following at the time. His name was Phil Booth in Toronto. And I had never had an astrology reading before, but he started talking to me about my chart. And he wasn't telling me to read tarot, but he said, I see a lot of people who have similar charts to you, and they're all into tarot. Are you interested in tarot? And it was just a way for him to make conversation with me. He wasn't diagnosing me as a tarot reader or anything like that. But
there's a diagnosis of being a tarot reader. Wow, that's
right. But when he said that, it was almost like someone had handed me a glass of water that I didn't know I needed. And it really brought me back to these things that I had been so interested in as a kid. And here I was really at a point in my life where I was searching for what was next for me. And I was looking for something, and I realized that tarot would be a great thing for me to start to get back into because I had the time to do it. I was more mature at that point than I had been when I was a kid trying to learn cards. And so I decided that I would listen to this little nugget of advice and go off and get a tarot deck. And sure enough, about a week or two after that, I was walking down the street in my neighborhood, and there was a pile of books someone had put out on the curb. And right on the top of that pile was a tarot book by Eden Gray. Wow. And I know. And so when you're asking if tarot found me, it's like, and in a way, yes. And I really took that as a sign. It was such a strong synchronicity to find that book right on top of that pile. And so that was I consider my real beginning with tarot. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, thank you for sharing that, because I always think it to me that the thread sounds relatively common when we hear, I call them tarot origin stories from our guests, where there's kind of that start, stop, start again. There's like, it's almost a calling to the tarot. Then it's like, oh, is this really for me? Or is it really, what I'm drawn to? And then there's that second or third or, next call. And it's like, yeah, this is, it's almost like you find the tarot, you stop, and then the tarot finds you, and then you sort of keep going. I don't mean to be putting words in your mouth, but that sounds like, it's like, oh, I knew what it was. and then I got this, this prescription almost from an astrologer, and here it goes. I'd love to ask you, because I find you, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is my perception of some of the classes I've taken with you. And even you almost alluded to it when you talked about, I wanted to read the cards right away. And I get the sense when I hear some of the work you do, you have a very visual and practical approach to working with the cards in a way that's, I don't want to say it's unique, because I think every practitioner has a way to look at it, but yours is I think is very much down that path of what I see in the card, and then an interpretation that often has a very everyday kind of practical. It's not up there in the ethereal clouds. Can you talk about how that's developed, or because I love it myself, and I think I've told you this before. One of the reasons I love taking some of your courses is it pushes me away from that. Oh my goodness, this card is linked to this and blah blah blah, and really does focus on an everyday, on kind of an everyday approach, linked to everyday things. So.
Yeah. No, you're right. Your perception is accurate.
Okay, thank you.
Practicality is really important for me in reading, because I always saw myself as someone who would read for other people. Once I got really deep into tarot, at first I was learning because I wanted to learn, but I think that I was always, my intention had always been that I wanted to be able to do this for others. I wasn't necessarily thinking about doing it professionally, right. But it's fun to receive a reading, and I've had some really great readings in my life, and I wanted to know how people did that. And so I realized quite early on that people have a lot of questions when they come for readings, and if you don't know how to put the cards into the context of a question, you're kind of stuck as a reader. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us learn tarot through memorizing card meanings, and that can be a great jumping off point. But if you go that road, and again, your goal is to read for other people, then you can quickly learn that those meanings only get you so far in terms of your interpretation, and that it's not really helpful to you as the reader, and it's certainly not helpful to the querent to have someone read cards who is just repeating the same things every time they see the death card, or every time they see the 5 of cups or the 10 of wands or whatever they're pulling, right? We can't just go around in circles with these same card meanings. And so one of the things that I had to puzzle through as I was learning tarot was, how do I put more language around this? And how do I start to understand how to actually answer specific questions that we might not be able to find answers to when we are looking at guidebooks and when we're going deep into studying guidebooks, right? Because again, those guidebooks will give you a general representation of what a card could be about, but it's not going to be able to get into the nitty-gritty of every single possible question that we could ask tarot, because those questions could go on forever. And so we have to find other layers that we can dig into. And for me, looking at cards visually has helped a lot with that, because it gives you, I think, a very literal bridge into what tarot is showing you. And if you take the time to turn your cards over and just look at what the cards are showing you in terms of those images, very often you will start to see accurate reflections of what someone is asking about right in those images, if you are using a deck that has really good readability. It doesn't work as well with those really beautiful abstract arty decks that some of us tend to love so much. But when we're working with decks that really clearly feature people, body language, actions, motion, all of those things, then we allow ourselves to have readings that suddenly become very, very specific. and very personalized to each situation that get us out of those repetitive keywords that sometimes we really cling to. And again, there's nothing wrong with clinging at first, right? I think we all have to go through that learning curve of just learning what to even say about a card, but at some point you have to take a leap away from that too, and that's where a lot of that visual style can come in.
Yeah, it's like, seeing a garden in a card. It can be about abundance, and it can be about fertility, and it can be about all those things, but it can also be about the garden that you have in your backyard. It can be about, finding, having to grow food. Like, it can be about, am I understanding it correctly? And somebody facing forward in a card can be literally about facing forward, or looking back can be about looking back, and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the body language is one of the simplest ways to start reading visually, because we can see, are all of the figures moving in the same direction? Is everybody moving backwards? Or are they all going off in different directions? Right. All of those things can suddenly be telling about the energy of a situation, or about maybe a piece of advice. If we're asking what to do about something and everyone's moving backwards, often I think, well, maybe there's a project that you've left undone that you have to go back and finish before you can get to this next thing that you're asking about, for example, right? And again, just looking at our patterns in our cards can give us these really simple answers, but really clear answers. And so, so it is about looking at those things. And that's also where we get to be a little bit creative and a little bit more intuitive with our readings as well, which is what a lot of us strive to do. Very often I have people come into my classes because they say, I want to read intuitively, but I don't know how to do that. And one of the things they say blocks them is that they've memorized all these card meanings, and they don't know if the meaning is the thing to go with, or if the meaning is actually suddenly getting in the way of their intuition and what could actually be behind the meaning. And so I find that when we allow ourselves to look at, whether it's a garden, whether it's an animal, some of those symbols, we have to, we get the opportunity to decide, is it relevant to the reading or not? I might notice a lot of things in the cards. Doesn't mean I'm going to talk about every single one of them, right? We have to learn how to make those judgment calls as readers. And we also have to learn that a lot of the times making readings overly complex or complicated and trying to talk about too many things probably isn't the way to go either. It's about finding a balance between that and recognizing that divination can actually be quite simple if we allow it to be, right? We have a tendency to want to overcomplicate a lot of our readings and put as much information in there as possible. But I find that sometimes those simple, easy answers can be the most effective for our queerance and for ourselves, because we don't often need a huge amount of detail and a long essay type of answer for a quick question.
I love that so much, and I have a million questions now that I want to ask.
I knew you would. I could see Bonnie just almost sitting there going, "Okay, here we go."
It's like a pinball machine. So I love that, and thank you for giving everybody permission, because I'm guilty of this. I soak up guidebooks, and I'm like, oh, well, what does this person have to say? And am I going to remember to say that? And it gives you permission. And I do this a lot in readings, if for myself or other people, I do allow that intuition to come in. And I'll even tell people, sometimes the meaning of this card, its original meaning doesn't really make sense in this context. This is what I'm seeing. So that's one thing. So thank you for sort of giving the community the permission to do that, because they think oftentimes we don't. The other question from fellow people who have way too many tarot decks, because the way certain deck creators create cards can actually influence the reading, right? Because of the images or the pictures that are on the cards. So do you tend to use the same decks because of the imagery and symbolism on those cards? Or do you tend to use different decks for different clients because you know that what you're seeing, if you're sort of allowing yourself to be more open to what you're seeing in the cards to sort of have that effect on the reading, do you do that? So just sort of
Yeah. No,
Curious.
it's a great question. And yes, when I read visually, I always recommend that whatever deck you're using is the deck that you want to have guiding you if you're taking that time to really look at what's there and to
Mhm.
let that imagery become part of the language of your interpretation. I'm not a deck jumper. I
I
I've
love that
used
deck
Right?
jumper. Okay.
I have a small collection of decks. I have about 50 decks, which I know is not a lot in the tarot world. It might sound like a lot to someone who isn't into tarot at all, but it's not a huge number
Yeah.
in the grand scheme of this community. And I think like many people, a lot of my decks sit on a shelf. Once in a while, I'll pull them out for fun and compare some of the imagery. But I've been using the same deck that I bought after I met with Phil Booth way back when, and that still is my go-to tarot deck, which is the Charmin Caselli, which is just a Rider-Waite-Smith replica deck basically, but I find it's really clear. It's always given me really good, accurate readings, and it's because it has such clear imagery. Then I do find that it gives her a really, really great visual story. Sometimes I'll also use the Cosmic Tarot. I like that for client work as well. That deck has a little bit more esoteric symbolism, but those are my two go-tos for client decks. And then when I teach tarot, I teach on the Rider-Waite-Smith because it has so much historical significance. It's not that it's necessarily my favorite deck. I think it's again, very important deck to understand. And so I like to teach on the Rider-Waite-Smith just so that we understand where our contemporary tarot images come from in modern tarot, because so many decks are based off of that one, and it was such a turning point for tarot history and tarot imagery. But again, to come back to your question, yeah, whatever you're working with is what you want to be reading from. And if you're reading visually or you want to give it a try, and you're looking at your decks and you're realizing that some of the artwork is beautiful, but it's not giving you a lot to go on, either symbolically or physically, then it's okay to switch, right? And see what's there. But always give it a try first, because it can be a little bit of a learning curve. If you're really used to reading, I say from your head, where you have all those meanings memorized and you're just trying to remember all of these details, to suddenly let your eyes start to do the talking first can take some time to get used to, because it does push you to have to let go of a lot of what's going on up here and really focus on what's happening here at eye level instead.
Yeah, and thank you for that, because I think that the same, people who they'll buy a deck and they'll continuously be focusing on that one deck. I think you've given people who are watching or listening permission to be like, you know what, if this deck isn't working for you, then it's not working for you. Give it a try. Tarot is not. I don't want to say it's not easy, because it's not. It has some complexity to it, so you might need to give it a bit of time. But it's not super complicated either. At some point in time, it's okay to say, hey, you know what, I'm putting this one aside and I'm gonna try something else. And I always think, when you talk about that visual medium, and then earlier on you had alluded to the idea of trying to embed sort of story and narrative into your reading experience, and kind of getting away from the sort of book based interpretation of cards. I'm curious to know, because as a writer of fiction, like how do writing and tarot and creativity all sort of intersect for you? Because like these would be things that you're actively engaged in at all times. And I wonder if all of those modalities, the creative aspect, the tarot piece, and then writing kind of come together. And if they do, how do they do that?
Yeah, I think that, I was writing before I was doing tarot, and I do find that there's a similar feel to divination and to creativity, in that when you're creating something, especially when you're writing, you're really taking a leap of faith with what you're putting down on paper. And You don't always know. A lot of my early starts in my writing career were in freelance journalism, and so I have an idea for a story, and I wouldn't always know how it would come together because I would have to go and corroborate my idea with sources and interviews and really see, what was this piece going to reveal to me, right? I wouldn't know until I had all of these disparate pieces of information to put it all together. And so it would sometimes, at first, when I was starting on that path, it was quite scary because, again, I could, I would have this concept in my head. I'd be excited that I had an assignment. But I'd walk around thinking, what is this going to become? And anyone who's written anything knows you often go through a few drafts, and somehow, as one draft comes together, it reveals other ideas to you, it reveals other parts of the structure, it reveals other aspects and angles. And so you get more clarity and you write the second draft and it becomes better. And then maybe you do a third draft and that's, that might be your best one. But you're really taking a leap of faith with the words that you're saying. And even if you're basing things on reality, there's still a leap of faith in how you are piecing together that information and what are you choosing to put forward.
Right. And I guess what are you not choosing to put forward as well?
Exactly.
Right?
How are you prioritizing those details? And this is the same way we read cards. What do you prioritize when you have all these cards on the table, right? And what do you start with? Where is the beginning of the story? These are two of the things that are very, very hard to learn in tarot, right? And this is where we often get overwhelmed as well. How do you trust yourself to just begin? And how do you trust yourself to have that, those first threads that are going to carry you through to the end? And so that's where I often see these similarities between creating and divination, in that both of us really push us to start to speak to something that hasn't existed yet, right? When we're divining, we're looking for some kind of answer or perspective that maybe hasn't been articulated up until this point, right? We might think it, we might feel it, but we don't have words for it yet. That can feel really scary. Mm-hmm. And it can feel really scary when you have a question and you're looking at cards that might feel disconnected to that question, or it might feel like you have a very disparate set of cards that don't really go together. And you're thinking, what am I to make of this, right? It's the same when you have an idea. You got a jumble of images that you want to put in your story. You have all these characters, you have these plot lines. You're sitting there thinking, what do I make of this? It's always like putting together a puzzle at first. But the only way to start to put that puzzle together is you just have to start. And through process of elimination, it becomes clearer and clearer, right? You start to talk about one thing and that might really clarify other parts of the reading that you're seeing. And so you get more confidence to continue and continue and continue. So that's really where I see parallels between the two processes. They're both uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And every time you do a reading, it can feel like you're back at the beginning with that reading, because every reading is going to be unique and different. And it's the same with writing as well. Every time you start a new book, back at the beginning, you start, and you start to question how am I going to do this, right? Yeah.
Well, it's vulnerable. It's that creative process that places you, because I would imagine writing those first few words in the same way as expressing those first few ideas, in a client session or when you're working with somebody else, is an exceptionally vulnerable place to be, because you're asking 400 different questions. What if I get it wrong? What if I don't? What if they don't connect? Like all of these kinds of things, right?
That's right. And it's very scary to also sometimes look at cards and again, know those standard meanings and say, I don't think any of those apply here. So I'm going to go off on my own direction and take that leap of faith. And very often I'll say to my querents, you know what, I'm just going to put this out there and you can tell me if this makes sense for you or not. And when you're able to let go of that and not have your ego involved in worrying about being perfect, I find that's one of the best things a reader can do for themselves, is just saying, I'm just going to put this out there. And if it doesn't make sense, it's okay. We'll move on. We'll just continue with the reading. But I want to put it here because it's nagging at me and there might be a reason for that. And if you just surrender to whatever is happening there, I find that can be very freeing, and it's a really great thing for us to be able to do as diviners as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when a thought comes in and you're like, there's no way I'm going to say this. But it's like, no, you have to say it.
Yeah.
And again, just be like, I don't know if this is going to make any sense to you, or sometimes the reading goes in a completely different direction than what the querent thought that they were coming in for. And even for them, they'll see an image on the card and be like, oh, what does that mean? And I'm like, well, what do you think it means? And then they'll be like, oh, it means this. And then the reading can. So I often include them as well to sort of get their perspective, because if they're asking me about an image, something particular on the card, I'll often be like, well, what does that mean for you? And then sort of go from there. So
yeah. And those images, again, I think sometimes we talk about those images from a student perspective. Those are the things that when we're learning, we can start to worry about, right? Which images do I have to pay attention to? Do I need to have a deep understanding of every single symbol in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck? Why are there crescent moons on the charioteer's shoulders? Right. Will I ever have to talk about that? Do I have to talk about the sphinxes in the chariot? Do I have to talk about Anubis on the Wheel of Fortune? These things, by and large, are probably never going to come up in a reading. So for anyone who's listening, who's suddenly thinking, oh my God, this sounds terrible, I don't want to do this. These are often things I try to veer students not away from. I think, right. Again, understanding why Pamela Coleman Smith and Arthur Edward Waite decided certain things were going to look the way they look can be an interesting study. Do we have to be able to recite all of those reasons by heart forever to our clients? Again, probably not. You're probably not going to talk about Egyptian myth in a reading. Right. Maybe once in a lifetime, you'll get that really, that client who really wants to go deep into that. But for the most part, people are going to be asking about really practical things. And so when I'm talking about looking at these visuals and symbols, I'm encouraging you to look at the simple stuff. Again, it's body language. It is, are we looking at a card that is happening in the day or at night? Are people sitting down or are they all moving? All of these are the kind of the basic simple things that we can get really interesting readings from. We don't have to go super, super deep and esoteric outside of what might be interesting for our own study.
Yeah. And some of those symbols as well have meanings that, either surpass or change over time too. So, something resting or weighing on your shoulders, although there might have been a purpose in 1909 when the Rider-Waite-Smith images came out, they're very different now. So it I guess what I'm hearing and what I have learned from you directly in some of your classes is allowing the images themselves to speak to the meanings of the cards. The other thing too is sometimes when you look visually, you can work with the deck forever and your years, and you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't even notice that particular image was in the card. And then all of a sudden it sort of it has significance that it didn't have before either. Or somebody points out, like Bonnie had said, they might ask, yeah, but what about that? Like I'm seeing that in the card and you're going, wow, okay, I'm noticing that for the very first time as well. So, let's kind of bring that into the story, bring that into the narrative that we're sharing.
Yes. And Peter, it's such a good point too about talking about how these things evolve and change, because they can also evolve and change just reading by reading, right? You could look at the same set of cards for one question and focus on a certain set of details or aspects of those cards. But then for a different question, those same cards, you'll have to highlight a completely different focus for each one. And so it's also, again, making sure that while we don't want to always just repeat the same card meanings every time we see certain cards come up, we also don't want to just always be focused on the same details or symbols every time, because it's always going to depend on the context and what's relevant to what we need to be talking about, right? So we can notice many things in our cards, And I think it's always great when our eyes is just trained and comfortable in noticing, but then it is about us learning how to make good judgment calls as to what is going to make sense for my interpretation at this point in time, and allowing that to become part of the art of your interpretation in building that confidence to make those decisions as you go along.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you talk about the idea of focusing only on certain things, it reminds me of an astrologer I know and know quite well, who will often say that it is at times I'll use her words, a rookie mistake, that you want to talk about everything because every sign shows up in a chart. Every planet shows up in a chart through house rulership, through planetary, like through aspect. And you have to pick and choose what's relevant to the question that your client or your querent is asking. In the same way, the question that they've asked is going to drive the narrative. And as you mentioned, some cards that show up in the same way for different questions are going to be read, in a very different way. So thank you for that, because I think for people who are listening, it helps understand the complexity of the cards themselves, and the fact that we can sometimes get the same cards that do mean somewhat different things depending on the question that we're asking. So,
for sure, and that's a really hard thing to trust, right? And it can sound sometimes, I think, jarring or concerning to anyone who considers themselves a tarot student when they hear someone say, you don't have to look at everything in every reading. It's a really hard thing to trust. And I sometimes I'll have students who come into classes and they want to know, they have so many questions. What does this mean? Why is it this color, right? Why, why was it drawn this way? What is this? What is this? What is this? What is this? And, first you have to think about, is in relation to what? Right? Because again, if you don't have a question in the first place, you're not sure how you're trying to relate this card to anything, it doesn't matter, right? It's just a picture right now. You're just looking at a card. And so you don't even have to be trying to decipher all of these symbols if you're not sure what you're measuring them up against. But then at the same time, you're probably not going to need to get into all of these details when you're actually doing a reading for someone, because your main focus is going to be answering their question, right? It's not about listing off all of the different things that you can know about a card or pointing out all of these symbols. It's about, what are you doing with the information that's there that's actually going to help somebody at the end of the day? And that's the thing you need to focus on learning.
Yeah. Nobody cares if this card is linked to the Sephiroth of blah, blah. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
It's like, all right, okay, that's great. Thank you.
Yes. And that, that for me was such an important thing to learn when I was starting out with tarot, because those are the things that are you can get so easily stuck on. But I have found that studying the history of the cards and the evolution of those images is very liberating, and it's a great thing to do for yourself if you're really serious about tarot and reading for others. Is if you go, back to medieval times when we see tarot's earliest images, and you start to look at how some of those pictures changed, especially on the major arcana, and ideas that were poured into them. Through, as the cards got into the hands of occultism throughout the 1700s and beyond, then we have this different understanding of, that people made these cards, right? People put their own ideas into them. They made them what they wanted them to be. But they've always evolved. They've always changed. There is no set of rules that we have to follow with tarot. And while we are at a point where we have standardized ideas and structures around how we want our decks to look and how many cards we want to have in those decks, at the end of the day, there's a lot of flexibility and fluidity as to how we can approach card reading.
I love that. And I love your explanation of sort of the evolution of the cards over, many years. How would you say your practice has changed over the years, right? Like, because I think how we get to know tarot and then how tarot evolves with us over the years is also a process as well. So do you have your own personal practice that you use with the cards daily? And if so, how has that changed over the years since you started working with it?
Oh yeah. I mean, my tarot practice has changed greatly from the beginning up until now. When I was getting serious about tarot, I was doing a lot of things that I think are quite common. I was doing a daily draw. I was journaling those daily draws. I was working with a lot of different types of tarot spreads. I was worrying about a lot of things we've been talking about. You know, do I need to learn the astrology of tarot, and do I need to learn all of these hermetic correspondences to tarot, and you know, who should I be listening to, and should I be studying a lot of Aleister Crowley, and you know, all of these different things, right? You know, it feels overwhelming at first, and so I think I was taking, you know, what I call a kitchen sink approach, which again, a lot of us do, right? You don't know what you don't know. And so you're trying to just grasp at as much information as possible. And, you know, eventually, I got to a point where I got more into tarot's history, and that really helped me to start to bring some focus into what I felt I wanted to be really looking at with tarot. But I was still doing a lot of other things. You know, I was working with reversals, which I don't use anymore. I was, by the time I was starting to work with clients in a professional capacity, I was doing very elaborate sessions, or I'd create customized tarot spreads for every client that came in, and working with really big spreads a lot of the time for myself and for others. And as the years went on, I started to simplify and simplify and simplify. I started to study more Marseille style tarot reading, which pushed that simplicity for me. And so what I got down to, and what I still do most often at this point in time, is I mostly do 3-card readings, no positions, all upright. We just start with a question and we go from there. And I have found, you know, in spite of all those big spreads I used to make and all the cards I used to pull, there's something about a simple 3-card open spread with a question that is all you need. And again, this can sound blasphemous to anyone who thinks you have to be doing everything, and you have to have significator cards and clarifier cards and
Celtic
reversals
cross,
and all this.
and here we go. Yep.
Exactly. Again, these are all techniques. I think we all find the techniques that really work for us. But you don't have to have every single technique that's been created around tarot in your practice. You know, find a few things that work really, really well for you, and find the things that support your goals as a reader, right? As I was saying earlier, my intention as a reader was always to read for others. And I found that people have a lot of questions. Where I was getting stuck early on in my professional practice was that I would spend all this time looking over people's intake forms, asking, you know, why do you want this session? What are we going to talk about? Creating a whole spread based around that. And then the person would show up and say, you know what? Changed my mind. I want to talk about something that just happened an hour before I got here. And I'd be like, oh, my whole spread would have to go out the window, right? Sad for me, but you got to work on the fly, because this is your client. It's not about you, right? It's not about the spread you made. They don't care. They want their questions answered. And I realized I had to learn how to be more flexible. And the 3-card reading allowed me to be very flexible and allowed me to really work on the fly, where if someone said, you know what, I just had a question pop into my head, can we look at this? I could just pull a few cards and away we go.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you. That is liberating.
Right? I was going to say, because part of the reason, I think, because, you know, when Bonnie and I started, this is very much a passion project, because we find the tarot to be a very effective tool, but we think a lot of people get stuck in how to start. Oh, do I have to do this? You know, all the myths around tarot, even we've got an episode that talks about that. Do I have to be gifted my first deck? Do I have to do blah, blah, blah? And it's wonderful to hear. And we've asked this question to a lot of our guests. I think it's liberating for people to hear and watch that a tarot practice changes over time, and that you had started with the kitchen sink approach, because I do think sometimes for some it's helpful, because it helps the narrative along. The more knowledge you have about a card, the more ways, the more different directions that you can go, including the visual kind of domain. If you understand a little bit about the symbols that are there, then you can include that in your narrative. But it isn't necessary, to understand the four worlds of the Sephiroth that are associated to each of the suits, and to understand the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and how they link to the major arcana. It's like, all right, fair enough, but yeah. So thank you, because I do think that and same with the idea of the development. I used to read a card a day, and how that shifts. That it's not dismissing people have a practice that where they draw a card of the day. Susie Chang was our latest guest, and she's got a very elaborate process around her card of the day and how she manages that. But it's allowing people, and I thank you again, who are like, yeah, but I'm just not going to do a card of the day. I'm gonna do this instead. That is totally fine. That you do you when it comes to tarot practice, and you sharing your story, I think has helped people who are watching or listening be able to do that. Bonnie, do you have anything you wanted to?
Yeah, no, I just I'm the same. I do 3 cards, right? And then we go from there. So then we'll do 3 cards first. And then if there's more questions that come from that, then we keep pulling. So I love to hear from somebody with as much wisdom and experience as you saying that, because I do sometimes I'm like, well, maybe I should have more elaborate spreads, and maybe I should be spending more time making spreads. But it's the simplicity, and I pull 3 cards for myself. So I don't know, 3 is like a magical number for me. I love that. And you can get so much information just from those 3 cards, and then see where it goes from there. So I love that. I'm feeling very good right now.
Yeah. And again, it's the simplicity. It's a hard thing to trust sometimes. And there's nothing wrong with having these changes, right? I don't know, I had to have the start with tarot that I did, because it got me to where I am now, and it helped me to understand these things and find my own way with it. So yeah, as Peter was saying, it's not that whatever you do is wrong or bad, right? When I was doing my daily draw, I needed that. I needed to be doing tarot on a daily basis. It was something that I was really doing for myself. It felt like a very significant time in my life to be going through that process. But at some point, I also got to where I was like, I don't feel like I need to pull cards every day, and that's also fine. Those things can change on a personal level, but your techniques can change, because again, they are techniques. And sometimes I have people ask when they come to me for readings, what spread are you using? They see the 3 card. They ask, is it past, present, future? What does each one represent? It's like, I don't look at cards like that. I look at them as talking to each other. And that's also okay. Right. And sometimes you might have clients, or you might have students who challenge you on some of those things because they expect tarot to look a certain way, or they've always done tarot in a way that maybe someone else taught them to do it. And we have to understand, again, that there is no one way to do this. If it works, it works. That's what I care about. Is it accurate, right? That's always my concern, because I read for other people. So I have to do things that are going to work for my clients. So that's what that's why I teach from the way that I teach, is that this is what I see working. I can vouch for these techniques. I can vouch for these methods. Because I've been doing it this way for long enough to have seen it take hold in people's lives. I have the client validation from that. So I have confidence in those methods, right? Just because I see someone using a certain spread or talking about tarot in a certain way isn't always enough for me. There are lots of people on social media who talk about tarot who don't even read for other people. Right. So we also have to keep that in mind when we're out there seeing all these things and we're trying to learn something, that there can be a lot of different pieces of advice out there, a lot of tips out there, a lot of ideas out there. But they're not always coming from people who have a track record of experience. Right. And so we also don't want to be so caught up in feeling like we have to be doing what we see everybody else doing, because you might not always be replicating the best ideas or the best methodologies available to you.
Yeah. No, that thank you, because that you're absolutely right. And when you talk about, your, yeah, I there is, especially now where sources of information on the tarot are everywhere. They're everywhere. And sometimes, it also isn't the person with, the most views or most reels or most followers that necessarily also has the most information. And I'm not dismissing that. That's not, but that's not the only indicator. There are times when somebody is sharing information and, they've been working with the tarot for all of 5 minutes. So you have to sometimes take that with a grain of salt.
For sure. I mean, you mentioned the question of should you buy, are you allowed to buy your own deck?
Right.
I thought that question had gone away, and I can't believe how often I hear it in the last couple of years of doing in-person tarot workshops again. I have had this question so many times. And I never had it before. And it's like, for me, this has to be coming from a viral video on TikTok or something, because I really thought we had put this one to bed.
With you.
And it's, again, it really speaks to, how vulnerable we are when we are trying to learn something and we're looking for information. And again, when you don't know what you don't know, how do you figure out what to listen to, right? Or which advice is good if you're not sure what to measure it up against? And those things are really tricky, because I legitimately wonder if people are kind of sitting there looking at all these tarot videos they see online thinking, oh, I'd really wish to do that, but I'm waiting for someone to give me a deck. What? Don't wait. Just go buy one.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many places you can go and buy them. And it used to be, it used to be that finding a tarot deck was a very difficult thing to do. You couldn't, right? Whereas now, I mean, basically every independent bookstore, has them. We live, I live in, and Bonnie lives close to a town of 30,000 people, and we have a Wicca-friendly, pagan-friendly, tarot-friendly shop where you can go and buy 40 or 50 decks at any given time. It's not hard. They're not hard to do. So, and the other thing too is and I can't personally vouch for many of our guests from a learning perspective, but if people are listening or watching and want to learn the tarot, I can personally vouch, for you as a teacher, you have taught me so much as a tarot practitioner. So if people are looking for a legitimate source of information for the tarot, I will, I'll do a small infomercial and just say, all right, send them your way. Because really, and I was somebody who had gone into your courses with already a pretty long, history, of studying the tarot. And, they're like, some of them are like just, wow, okay, thank you for teaching me this, including the book, The Power of Tarot, like I said, which, I've passed on to somebody else now so that they can learn too. I don't know. Bonnie, is it that time? Are we at that?
It's that time. Yeah. We don't want, we could talk to you all day.
We totally could.
Do we want to pull a card? So at the end of our episodes, Liz, we each pull a card, and when we have a guest on, we let the guest pull first if you feel comfortable.
Okay.
So you just pull a card and then let us know what you think about it. Or if you get like a collective message or whatever you want to say about the card is completely encouraged.
Okay. Oops. Is that how you usually look at it? A collective message?
You know what? Sometimes, honestly, I got to tell you, we've probably gone in all kinds of different directions. Sometimes what we'll do is we'll take a look at I often look at it and give 2 or 3 different sort of interpretations of the card. We've had people, I think Sasha Graham, when we had her on, did sort of a collective message. I'm trying to think. I think we've had practitioners focus on a particular question. So in the same way, we've talked almost that one of the running themes through this episode has been, you do what works for you when it comes to tarot. Liz will do the same thing. We'll say, you do what works for you in a single card draw, whatever it is you want to focus on. We're all ears.
Perfect. All right. Well, I pulled Page of Swords from my Charmin Casali deck.
Okay.
It's kind of hard to see. It's very...
Yeah.
So this is actually a great card to talk about based on everything we've discussed today. Because for me, the the pages are their apprentices, right? They are about learning. And the Page of Swords is often a strong representation of the phrase beginner's mind when I look at this card. Is that it's so important for us to maintain a beginner's mind, even if we've been on the tarot path for a long time. Hearing other people talk about their perspectives with tarot and what they do and what they find works, it really can open up other doors for you. And even if, someone is doing something completely different, or it's not even something that you would adopt into your practice, but just hearing them talk about it can be so refreshing and so interesting. And again, a great reminder, I think, to stay humble on the path as well, right? Because, we all do what works for us, but it doesn't mean it's the only way. It doesn't mean it's the one way. Doesn't mean it's the best way for everyone. And so when I see that little page there, that's what it makes me think of, right? Is just, to keep learning and keep an open mind with everything.
I love that word. You use the word humility. I love that with the Page of Swords, because I think any page I think they all almost have that ingrained sense of humility built in, regardless, I always think of the court cards as kind of ruling in some kind of a realm. And, the idea of the page being in that Page of Swords, that realm of idea and that realm of word, that, there is a sense of humility. There's I know something. I'm part of the royal family, but I don't know everything, so I'm really open to my transition from page to knight to queen to king. I don't know. That's the only thing that I would add, because we often will kind of add to the cards. I don't know, Bonnie, what about you? Thank you for that. I
know. And it's such an honor when our guests come on and they read a card. We're like, oh, it's so great. But I love that. And I think the Page of Swords is so, and I didn't mention this before you pulled the card and said like, oh, how are we doing this reading? Most of the time, whatever cards we're pulling is very resonant to what we've been talking about in the episode. And I think that page is like a perfect example of that. And a lot of the reasons of why we've done this podcast is to help people who are curious about tarot, or to know like there isn't just one way to do it. Like, what are different people's perspectives? And I love that about this page, because they're curious and they're learning. And by hearing your perspective about the cards of like, yeah, learning is important, but that's not the only thing. Like, how else can we look at these cards? So I think that's just a perfect way to sum up what we've been talking about. That it's and even you're always on this journey. Like, I don't think there's ever going to be a point in your life where you're like, oh, I know everything there is to know about tarot, and I'm done. Like, that we're always on this journey. So I love that message.
Yep. All right. You want me to draw, or are you going to draw, Bonnie?
Doesn't matter. I have my card. Do you have your card?
I haven't drawn it yet. I'm still shuffling my deck and then pausing every so often, because I'm worried that the shuffling noise, or me basically fumbling and dropping cards as I shuffle, is being heard. So I'm still shuffling. If you've drawn your card, then
okay. Yeah.
I'll actually stop in here. I'm going to stop and draw, and then I'll stop and draw and wait. All right.
Okay, so I'm using the Earth Woman Tarot by Tarn Ellis, and I pulled the Two of Swords. So the swords is like our little theme here. I also think about this too, in terms of what we've been talking about, right? Making decisions and not really knowing what the outcome is going to be. So sometimes it's like, how do I make a decision? If I want to know what's going to happen if I make this decision, right? And I think that's hard. And not making a decision is still making a decision. So maybe thinking about how we approach the cards, or when we get a card, it's like, oh, well, do I read it from the perspective of what I know, or can I broaden my perspective and see what's actually in this card? The Two of Swords comes up a lot for me with decision making, but I do see it as an opportunity to really trust and sort of look at all of the options when you are making a decision. And the blindfold really serves a beautiful purpose, because it can either be that you need to put the blindfold on to sort of block out all of the external noise, or sometimes when we have the blindfold on, we sort of can't see the bigger picture. So wherever you sit in that sense of trying to make a decision, do you need to see it broader? Then take that blindfold off so you can see. Or if you need to really come inside and really trust what's going on, then that would be helpful for you. So that's sort of my take on the Two of Swords. Would anybody else like to add their perspective?
Yeah. Liz, would you like to add a perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I love that you talked about that blindfold. That's one of my favorite details to look at with that card. And I agree. Sometimes we do have to have the blindfold on to shut things out, right? As you know, as we've been talking about today, sometimes it is about sort of finding a focus and going deep in something rather than wide. It's so easy to go wide in this world, and that's how sometimes you're not sure what you're working with, what makes sense, and everything can start to feel unwieldy. But if we tune things out a little bit and just almost be like the two of swords and find perhaps one or two things we're going to focus on.
Yep.
At once and realize that's enough. Your hands are full. If you've got a couple of areas of study or a couple of techniques that we're looking at, whether it's a tarot or anything else, then that really allows you to have that depth and that's where we start to gain a lot of confidence and a sense of mastery over something, is when we allow ourselves to go a bit deeper.
Well, yeah, I'm probably I would focus on the blindfold as well, because I think it's not unique. There are other cards, particularly one in the swords, where somebody is blindfolded in a deck. But to me, the blindfold also speaks to that concept of vulnerability. When one of our senses is taken away, we are vulnerable, and to go with. I'm also influenced by the card that I just drew and flipped over and is kind of sitting, out of the camera. But around that idea of starting, when you talk about the idea of, kind of choosing one or two things, choosing something different, choosing a pathway to go on, actually places us in a vulnerable position. Like, to have to make that choice means that, to use, a phrase that Liz, you used several times in this podcast, you have to make that leap of faith. That can be a scary space to be. So I always see that blindfold as, we're beings who have at least five senses available to us, and the blindfold takes one away. And it's one that's exceptionally important to us. And when that happens, we are vulnerable. But it is an invitation to be, okay, if we're limited in our scope, what else can we draw on? What other choices can we make? How can we sort of move past that vulnerability in that one? That would be the only thing that, I would add with that. But I think the blindfold is one of those things in that card where you're like, oh, that blindfold, is often says something. So, all right.
Okay, Peter, what did you draw?
So, first I'm going to explain why. So I've used this deck several times, but today I chose it because I chose Isabella Rotman's This Might Hurt Tarot. And I don't know, Liz, if you remember, I think this was a deck that a student in sort of your student collective had once brought forward. And it ran me to have to go and buy this deck. And it was at the time that she wasn't selling it through Liminal 11 or through the mass production. I had to buy it directly from her. And I absolutely love the deck. So I thought, well, if we have Liz Worth coming on as a guest, then I'm going to at least use the deck that I first sort of found out, in one of her student spaces. And actually, I drew the Ace of Wands. So then to sort of, so I want to try and look at the card, because I think in this particular iteration of the card, and for those of you who can't see it, who are listening on one of the many platforms, I'm going to kind of describe it, because it does look very much like the Rider-Waite-Smith, except the background is quite different. So the background of the card actually has sort of a modern city, but what you can't see is in the foreground / background are wind turbines. So I thought, the background kind of draws me a little bit to this card, big city, lots of opportunity to big city, but you've got the wind turbines that really do talk about that idea of innovation. And I think this is a card that really does focus on that innovation. It's a great, let's get started on that bold project. Let's take that leap of faith, take that first step, or let's accept an offering, right? We've got that kind of hand coming out of the cloud that leads us into a new direction. Do we, embrace the fire, the passion that kind of sits with this suit? So I'm like, if it was for those of you who are going, oh, look, I've been listening to this podcast a couple of episodes, but I haven't really started along the pathway towards learning the tarot. The Ace of Wands is saying, how about now, right? How about using the courage to, kind of start this journey? How about planting that seed that may eventually grow into a practice, of some kind? I also think that when I see the Ace of Wands, that it, to get into the kind of elemental piece, it is very much a fire card. So I think sometimes the downfall of this card might be that it is singular. Sometimes we need a singular focus, but sometimes it can be overly singular, one being singular. It can be overly singular. It forgets that if we plant a seed, we also need water. We also need light. We need kind of other things, for this card. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of in light of what we've talked about. Might be an invitation to be, hey, here you go. You wanted an excuse to jump onto the tarot bandwagon and to start looking at things. Ace of Wands is a great card to be able to get that kind of passion project rolling. It's also something, talk about passion, sometimes in another direction. Sometimes it's a card that, if you were looking for, something hot and erotic and passionate, this card also sometimes gives a great big hell yes to that particular question. So that's what I've got with the Ace of Wands. Either one of you want to jump in, by all means. So.
Sure. Liz, do you want to add?
It's interesting. They're all low numbers, that we have, right? Yeah. It's just, it's a 1 or a 2. And so every time I see patterns like that, it's especially with the aces, it's a great reminder that it is about taking one step at a time and really starting small, not letting yourself get overwhelmed as we've been talking about. And remembering that again, you can go so far if you take that kind of approach in just getting things in I don't want to say bite-sized pieces. I don't know if that's always the right term, but again, instead of thinking that we have to do everything all at once, know everything all at once, be everything all at once. So kind of just be where you are, even if it's at the beginning. That is totally fine because you have to be somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, I love that. You have to be somewhere. That's right. What a great subtitle for, that. Have to be somewhere.
Yeah. You have to be somewhere. Yeah, I love the Ace of Wands. And I think it plays so nicely with your Page of Swords, right? Because I often think about pages and aces as very similar, like the beginning of something. And when I see that Ace of Wands, it's almost like being passed and presented this opportunity to like go and do something you're really passionate about. So, and again, it's just taking that first step and not trying to have, like having it all figured out. And but actually doing something because it's potential. It doesn't mean it's happened yet, but you're being offered that. And sometimes we let those opportunities pass us by, right? So I think if you're listening and there's something that you're really passionate about and there's an opportunity to do something, this would be a great time to be curious about that, make that decision and, move forward with that. So I love that.
All right. Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of the episode. But before we sort of, before we put an end to our episode, Liz, can you tell people what you have going on, where they might be able to find you as well?
Yeah, the best place to find me is through my website, which is lizworth.com. I'm also on Instagram at Lizworth Tarot. And I post whatever I've got going on those two places. If you go to my website, you can also join my newsletter, which is a great place to keep informed about what's coming up. And I tend to send out a newsletter once a week with just talking about some different tarot things. So you'll get some tips or different ideas from that as well. And that can be a great place to begin to connect with me and learn more about what I'm doing and get some good info, I think, too.
Yes. As a subscriber to your newsletter, I would absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Amazing. And Peter, where can people find you?
Well, people can always find me at peterwhitetarot.com, Instagram as well, on occasion at Peter White Tarot, Facebook, same thing. And I would do the same, on my website. Best place to kind of keep up to date would be on my newsletter, which is biweekly. It's actually, it's a lunation newsletter. So I focus on work where I kind of send out a free lunation spread at both the new and the full moon as a place to start. So if that's of interest to you, then pop over to my website and register for that. Bonnie, how about you?
Awesome. Same. You can the best place to find me is on my website it's breathewithbonnie.com. I am on Instagram at breathewithbonnie, but not all the time. I also have a newsletter if you want to see what I have coming up. I send a monthly newsletter with, I create an intention every month based on a card reading. So that's always fun. But yeah, lots of tarot tips, lots of, self-compassion, meditation tips in there. I love to blend tarot and meditation together. So yeah, if you'd like to sign up for my newsletter, you can do that on my website. And Liz, it's been such a pleasure to have you on our show. I was so excited for this episode, and I'm even more excited that I got to speak to you and meet you, even though it's, over the internet. But we want to thank you for being here. I'm sure our listeners are super excited to be able to listen to this and gain so much wisdom from you. You've shared so much today, and it's been incredible. And if you like this episode, we would love for you to leave us a nice review, subscribe, share with all your friends. I mean, this is amazing information. So we thank you all for being here, and we can't wait to see you next time on Tarot with Bonnie and Peter. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you so much. This is great.
Thank you.
Bye.